Margaret Chen had always been different from other women her age. While her classmates in college spent their evenings at parties and social gatherings, she preferred the solitude of the shooting range. Her father, a retired Army sergeant, had taught her to shoot when she was barely 12 years old. What started as weekend bonding time between father and daughter had evolved into something much more significant. By the time she turned 25, Margaret had become one of the finest marksmen in the entire state. Her shooting skills were legendary among the small community of competitive shooters, but she remained largely unknown to the general public. She preferred it that way. Margaret was naturally reserved, speaking only when necessary and keeping her personal life completely private. Standing at 5 feet and 8 inches tall, with a lean, muscular build from years of disciplined training, Margaret possessed an androgynous appearance that often confused strangers. Her dark hair was always cut short in a practical style, and she favored loose-fitting clothing that concealed her feminine features. This wasn't intentional deception. It was simply her preference for comfort and functionality. The local shooting range where Margaret practiced daily was called Precision Point. It was owned by an elderly man named Frank Morrison, who had served in Vietnam and understood the dedication required to master marksmanship. Frank had watched Margaret develop her skills over the years and had deep respect for her abilities. He often told other shooters that Margaret had natural talent he'd rarely seen in his 40 years of teaching. Margaret's daily routine was predictable and disciplined. She arrived at Precision Point every morning at 6 o'clock sharp, before the facility officially opened. Frank always let her in early because he knew she valued the quiet hours when she could practice without distractions. She would spend 2 hours working on her technique, focusing on breathing, stance, and precision. Her targets consistently showed groupings that most professional shooters would envy. The other regular patrons at Precision Point had grown accustomed to Margaret's presence, though few had ever engaged her in conversation. She was polite but distant, responding to greetings with brief nods and keeping interactions purely professional. Most assumed she was simply a serious competitive shooter who preferred solitude. Some occasionally wondered about her background, but Margaret never volunteered personal information. What the other shooters didn't know was that Margaret's exceptional skills had caught the attention of several military recruiters over the years. She had received numerous offers to join various branches of the armed forces, but she had consistently declined. Margaret valued her independence and wasn't interested in the structured military lifestyle. She was content with her civilian job as a computer programmer and her morning shooting practice. Margaret's apartment was modest but comfortable, reflecting her practical personality. The walls were adorned with shooting competition certificates and photographs of her with her father at various ranges. Her father had passed away 2 years earlier from cancer, and shooting had become her way of staying connected to his memory. Every morning before heading to the range, she would look at his photograph and silently promise to maintain the standards he had taught her. Her work as a computer programmer suited her perfectly. She could focus on complex problems without dealing with extensive social interaction. Her colleagues respected her technical skills but knew little about her personal interests. Margaret had carefully compartmentalized her life, keeping her professional world separate from her passion for marksmanship. The shooting community in their mid-sized city was relatively small, and most serious practitioners eventually crossed paths at competitions or training events. Margaret participated occasionally in local competitions, though she rarely stayed for the social gatherings afterward. She would arrive, compete with devastating accuracy, collect any prizes she earned, and leave quietly. Her reputation was built entirely on her performance, rather than her personality. Frank Morrison had often encouraged Margaret to consider more advanced training opportunities. He believed her skills were being wasted in small local competitions, and that she could excel at national levels. However, Margaret consistently declined these suggestions. She maintained that shooting was her personal passion, not a career ambition. Frank respected her position but couldn't help feeling that someone with her exceptional abilities should share them with a broader community. Margaret's typical day at the range involved systematic practice with different firearms. She was equally proficient with handguns, rifles, and even some specialized military weapons that Frank occasionally allowed experienced shooters to use. Her technique was flawless, developed through years of methodical practice and natural aptitude. Other shooters would sometimes pause their own practice to observe her form, though they maintained respectful distance. The range had unspoken protocols that everyone followed. Margaret's preferred lanes were generally left available for her morning sessions, and other shooters adjusted their schedules accordingly. This wasn't due to any formal arrangement. It was simply recognition of her dedication and skill level. Frank had never needed to establish official policies because the community naturally accommodated each other's preferences. Margaret's shooting attire was always practical and professional. She wore simple dark clothing that allowed free movement, safety glasses that fit perfectly, and hearing protection that didn't interfere with her concentration. Her appearance at the range was consistently gender neutral, though this was purely coincidental rather than intentional. She dressed for function rather than fashion, prioritizing comfort and performance over appearance. The ammunition Margaret used was carefully selected and maintained. She hand-loaded much of her own ammunition to ensure consistency and accuracy. This meticulous attention to detail extended to every aspect of her shooting practice. Her firearms were maintained in perfect condition, cleaned and inspected regularly according to her father's teachings. Other range patrons occasionally attempted to engage Margaret in conversation about techniques or equipment, but these interactions were typically brief. She would answer specific questions politely but wouldn't elaborate beyond the necessary information. Most people interpreted this as professional focus rather than antisocial behavior, which was accurate. Margaret's skill level had reached the point where she rarely missed her intended target, regardless of distance or conditions. Frank had measured her accuracy numerous times and consistently found her performance exceptional. She could place shots within millimeters of her intended point of impact, even under challenging conditions like varying wind or poor lighting. The local law enforcement community was aware of Margaret's reputation, though she had never formally trained with police officers. Several departments had approached her about providing marksmanship instruction, but she had politely declined these opportunities. Margaret preferred to maintain her privacy and avoid any official associations that might complicate her quiet lifestyle. Her father's influence on Margaret's approach to shooting extended beyond technical instruction. He had emphasized discipline, respect for firearms, and the importance of continuous improvement. These values had shaped Margaret's character as much as her shooting ability. She approached every practice session with the same seriousness and dedication that her father had demonstrated throughout his military career. The range's other regular patrons had developed theories about Margaret's background over the years. Some speculated that she had military training, while others assumed she was a competitive shooter taking a break from circuit competition. A few believed she might be law enforcement, though her practice schedule didn't align with typical police training routines. Margaret never corrected these assumptions or provided clarification about her actual background. Frank Morrison had witnessed thousands of shooters develop their skills over his decades of range ownership, but Margaret's progression had been uniquely impressive. She had arrived as a competent shooter with solid fundamentals and had systematically refined every aspect of her technique. Her dedication to improvement was relentless, but never obsessive. She maintained perfect balance between intense focus and relaxed confidence. Margaret's morning routine at the range had become so predictable that Frank could set his watch by her arrival and departure. She would enter quietly, set up her equipment methodically, conduct her practice session with unwavering concentration, clean up thoroughly, and leave with minimal conversation. This consistency had made her an ideal patron from Frank's perspective. The advanced shooting techniques that Margaret had mastered went far beyond basic marksmanship. She could engage multiple targets in rapid succession while maintaining accuracy, shoot effectively from various positions and angles, and adapt quickly to changing conditions. These skills suggested training that exceeded typical civilian instruction, though Margaret had never revealed the source of her advanced knowledge. Her equipment was high quality but not ostentatious. Margaret selected firearms and accessories based on performance, rather than appearance or prestige. She owned several different weapon systems and was equally proficient with all of them. This versatility was unusual among civilian shooters, who typically specialized in specific types of firearms. The shooting community had informal networks for sharing information about techniques, equipment, and opportunities. Margaret participated minimally in these communications, though she was always respectful and professional in her interactions. Most members understood that she preferred privacy and didn't press for personal details or social engagement. Margaret's accuracy standards were extraordinarily high, even by professional standards. She would repeat exercises until her performance met her own exacting criteria, often continuing practice long after most shooters would consider their session complete. This perfectionist approach had contributed significantly to her exceptional skill development. The range's safety protocols were second nature to Margaret, who followed every rule meticulously and set an excellent example for other shooters. Frank had never needed to remind her about safety procedures or range etiquette. Her disciplined approach to firearms handling reflected the thorough training her father had provided during her formative years. As Margaret prepared for what would become a life-changing morning at the range, she had no indication that her carefully maintained privacy was about to be shattered. The routine that had provided stability and purpose for years was about to be disrupted by an encounter that would challenge everything she had built for herself. The reserved woman who had successfully avoided attention was about to discover that some talents are too exceptional to remain hidden forever. The morning of March 15th started like any other for Margaret Chen. She arrived at Precision Point at exactly 6 o'clock, carrying her familiar gear bag and wearing her standard practice attire. Frank Morrison unlocked the door for her with his usual friendly nod, and Margaret made her way to Lane 7, her preferred position at the range. What Margaret didn't know was that today would bring unexpected visitors to the normally quiet facility. Colonel James Patterson of the United States Army had arranged to visit Precision Point as part of a recruitment evaluation mission. The military was actively seeking exceptional marksmen for a specialized program, and several sources had mentioned the range as a location where skilled shooters practiced regularly. Colonel Patterson was accompanied by Staff Sergeant Maria Santos, a skilled markswoman herself who served as a recruitment specialist. They had arrived early to observe the range operations and identify potential candidates for their program. Frank Morrison had been notified of their visit but had chosen not to inform his regular patrons, wanting to allow them to shoot normally without the pressure of military observation. Margaret began her practice session with her standard warm-up routine, completely unaware that she was being watched. Colonel Patterson and Staff Sergeant Santos positioned themselves in the observation area where they could view the active lanes without disturbing the shooters. Within minutes of watching Margaret's performance, both military professionals recognized that they were witnessing exceptional skill. The precision of Margaret's shooting was immediately apparent to the trained eyes of the military observers. Every shot was placed exactly where intended, with groupings that exceeded the standards they typically saw from their own trained snipers. Colonel Patterson quietly noted Margaret's technique, stance, and breathing patterns, all of which demonstrated advanced training and natural ability. Staff Sergeant Santos was equally impressed, but also puzzled by Margaret's appearance and mannerisms. From their observation position, Margaret's gender wasn't immediately obvious due to her practical clothing and short haircut. The military observers initially assumed they were watching a young male shooter with exceptional abilities. Margaret continued her practice session, working through increasingly difficult shooting scenarios. She engaged targets at various distances, practiced rapid target acquisition, and demonstrated precision shooting from multiple positions. Each exercise was executed with mechanical precision that impressed even the experienced military personnel watching her performance. Colonel Patterson had been in the military for over 20 years and had observed countless shooters during his career. Margaret's skill level was extraordinary by any standard, exceeding what he typically saw from soldiers with years of specialized training. He began formulating plans to approach this exceptional shooter about military service opportunities. The observation continued for nearly an hour, with Margaret remaining completely focused on her practice. She demonstrated proficiency with multiple weapon systems, switching between different firearms with seamless efficiency. Her technique remained flawless regardless of the specific weapon she was using, indicating comprehensive training and exceptional adaptability. Frank Morrison eventually approached the military observers to discuss what they had witnessed. Colonel Patterson expressed immediate interest in recruiting the skilled shooter, referring to Margaret as he, based on his assumptions about her gender. Frank realized the misunderstanding but decided to let the situation develop naturally rather than immediately correcting the colonel's assumption. As Margaret's practice session neared its end, Colonel Patterson made the decision to approach her directly. He wanted to discuss potential military opportunities with someone of her caliber. Staff Sergeant Santos accompanied him as they walked toward Lane 7, where Margaret was cleaning her equipment after completing her morning routine. Margaret noticed the approaching military personnel but didn't immediately recognize their intent. She had encountered military recruiters before and had always politely declined their offers. However, she had never been approached while actually demonstrating her shooting abilities, and the timing seemed unusual for a casual recruitment conversation. Colonel Patterson approached with professional courtesy, preparing to address what he believed was a young male shooter. His military bearing was evident as he walked confidently toward Margaret's position. Staff Sergeant Santos followed slightly behind, observing the interaction and prepared to provide additional information about recruitment opportunities. The moment that would change everything occurred when Colonel Patterson reached Margaret's lane. He had prepared his standard recruitment introduction, designed to express appreciation for exceptional skill while introducing potential military opportunities. However, his assumptions about Margaret's identity were about to be dramatically corrected. "Excuse me, sir," Colonel Patterson began, using the respectful address he typically employed when approaching potential male recruits. "I'm Colonel Patterson, United States Army. I've been observing your shooting, and I must say your skills are exceptional." Margaret turned to face the colonel, her feminine features immediately apparent at close range. The mistake in gender identification became obvious to everyone present, creating an awkward moment that would have significant consequences for all involved. Colonel Patterson's expression shifted from professional confidence to surprised confusion as he processed the correction to his assumptions. Staff Sergeant Santos immediately recognized the situation and stepped forward to provide diplomatic support. However, the damage to the colonel's composed approach had already been done. The formal military introduction had been undermined by the fundamental error in identifying Margaret's gender, creating an uncomfortable dynamic for the recruitment conversation. Margaret's response to being addressed as "sir" was measured but clearly indicated her awareness of the mistake. She had experienced similar confusion before, due to her appearance, but never in such a formal military context. The situation presented a dilemma about how to respond professionally while maintaining her preferred privacy. The colonel quickly attempted to recover from his error, apologizing for the mistaken identification and expressing admiration for Margaret's demonstrated skills. However, the initial mistake had created an unusual dynamic that made the conversation more complex than typical recruitment discussions. Margaret found herself in the center of attention she had always tried to avoid. Frank Morrison observed the interaction from a distance, recognizing that Margaret's carefully maintained privacy was being challenged by the military interest in her abilities. He considered intervening but decided to allow Margaret to handle the situation according to her own preferences. The range owner understood the value of Margaret's skills but respected her desire for anonymity. Other shooters at the range began to notice the conversation between Margaret and the military personnel. The unusual sight of a colonel engaging with one of their fellow practitioners created curiosity about the nature of their discussion. Margaret became increasingly aware that her normally private practice session had become a public spectacle. Colonel Patterson pressed forward with his recruitment presentation despite the awkward beginning, explaining the specialized program that had brought him to the range. He described opportunities for advanced training, competitive shooting, and service that would utilize Margaret's exceptional abilities. His enthusiasm for her skills was evident despite the confused introduction. Margaret listened politely to the colonel's presentation, but maintained her characteristic reserve. She had heard similar offers before and had consistent reasons for declining military service. However, the public nature of this recruitment attempt created pressure she hadn't experienced in previous encounters with military representatives. Staff Sergeant Santos provided additional details about the program, emphasizing the respect for skilled marksmen within the military community and the opportunities for personal and professional development. She attempted to address potential concerns about military service while highlighting the benefits that exceptional shooters could gain from specialized training programs. The conversation continued for nearly 20 minutes, with Colonel Patterson becoming increasingly impressed by Margaret's knowledge and professionalism. However, Margaret's responses remained measured and non-committal. She answered questions about her background carefully, providing minimal information while remaining respectful to the military personnel. Other range patrons had begun to gather at a respectful distance, curious about the extended conversation between Margaret and the military representatives. The attention was exactly what Margaret had always tried to avoid, and she found herself becoming uncomfortable with the public scrutiny of her normally private activity. Colonel Patterson made increasingly generous offers, discussing special programs and opportunities that would typically appeal to skilled shooters. Margaret's consistent lack of enthusiasm puzzled him, as most civilians with her abilities would be interested in military applications for their skills. He began to wonder about her reasons for remaining in civilian life. The situation became more complicated when Colonel Patterson suggested that Margaret's skills were being wasted in civilian applications. He implied that someone with her abilities had a patriotic obligation to serve their country in a military capacity. This suggestion crossed a line that Margaret found personally offensive, though she maintained her composure. Margaret's response to the colonel's pressure was firm but diplomatic. She explained that she was satisfied with her civilian life and had no interest in military service, regardless of the opportunities offered. Her polite but definitive rejection surprised the military personnel, who were accustomed to more positive responses from skilled shooters. The conversation reached a turning point when Colonel Patterson asked directly about Margaret's training background, seeking to understand the source of her exceptional abilities. Margaret's reluctance to provide detailed information about her father's instruction and her own development created additional tension in the already awkward exchange. Staff Sergeant Santos recognized that the recruitment approach wasn't succeeding and attempted to conclude the conversation diplomatically. However, Colonel Patterson was reluctant to abandon his pursuit of such an exceptional potential recruit. His persistence began to make Margaret visibly uncomfortable, though she maintained her professional demeanor. Frank Morrison finally decided to intervene when he noticed Margaret's growing discomfort with the extended recruitment conversation. He approached the group and provided a diplomatic exit opportunity, mentioning range scheduling issues that required attention. Margaret gratefully accepted this intervention as a way to conclude the unwanted interaction. The military personnel eventually departed, but not before Colonel Patterson provided his contact information and encouraged Margaret to reconsider her position. He emphasized that the offer would remain open and that someone with her abilities would always be welcome in the military community. Margaret accepted his card politely, but without commitment. After the military representatives left, Margaret found herself the center of attention from other range patrons who had witnessed the extended recruitment conversation. The privacy she had carefully maintained for years had been shattered by a single encounter, and she realized that her anonymous shooting practice was no longer possible. The implications of the morning's events began to settle on Margaret as she completed her equipment cleanup. Her exceptional skills had attracted official military attention, creating complications she had always sought to avoid. The simple mistake in gender identification had led to consequences that would fundamentally change her relationship with the shooting community. Frank Morrison approached Margaret after the other patrons had returned to their practice, offering support and understanding. He apologized for not warning her about the military visit and expressed concern about the disruption to her normal routine. Margaret appreciated his consideration but realized that the damage to her privacy had already been done. As Margaret prepared to leave the range, she understood that her carefully constructed quiet life had been irreversibly altered. The morning that had started like any other had ended with challenges to her anonymity and independence that she would need to address. The reserved woman who had successfully avoided attention now faced a future where her exceptional abilities had made privacy impossible to maintain. The days following Colonel Patterson's visit to Precision Point brought changes that Margaret Chen had never anticipated. Word of her exceptional shooting abilities and the military's interest had spread throughout the local shooting community faster than she could have imagined. Her carefully guarded privacy, maintained for years through disciplined routine and deliberate anonymity, had been shattered in a single morning. Margaret's first indication that her life had fundamentally changed came when she arrived at the range 3 days after the colonel's visit. Instead of the usual quiet morning atmosphere she valued, she found several unfamiliar faces waiting in the parking lot. These weren't typical recreational shooters. They appeared to be reporters and photographers who had somehow learned about the military recruitment incident. Frank Morrison intercepted Margaret before she could reach the range entrance, explaining that multiple media outlets had contacted him about the story of a mysterious female marksman who had caught the attention of military recruiters. Despite Frank's attempts to protect Margaret's privacy, the story had taken on a life of its own within the broader community. The local newspaper had published an article titled, "Mystery Sharpshooter Impresses Military Officials." though they lacked sufficient details to provide Margaret's name or extensive background information. However, the article had generated significant interest among shooting enthusiasts, military supporters, and curious members of the general public who were intrigued by the story. Margaret realized that her morning shooting routine, which had provided stability and purpose for years, would need to be dramatically altered. The presence of media personnel and curious onlookers made her normal practice impossible. She felt frustrated and invaded, emotions she wasn't accustomed to experiencing in connection with her beloved shooting practice. Frank Morrison offered to provide Margaret with exclusive access to the range during off hours, allowing her to continue her practice without public interference. While Margaret appreciated his consideration, she understood that the fundamental nature of her shooting experience had been permanently altered by the unwanted attention and publicity. Over the following week, Margaret received numerous phone calls from various parties interested in her abilities. Military recruiters from different branches contacted her directly, having obtained her information through unclear channels. Competitive shooting organizations extended invitations to tournaments and events. Several private security companies offered employment opportunities that would utilize her marksmanship skills. Most surprising to Margaret were the calls from television producers and documentary filmmakers who wanted to feature her story in programs about exceptional civilian shooters or women in traditionally male-dominated activities. These media requests were particularly disturbing to Margaret, who had never sought public attention and found the prospect of media coverage deeply uncomfortable. Margaret's workplace began experiencing similar intrusions when reporters contacted her employer seeking information about the mysterious sharpshooter. Her colleagues, who had known nothing about her shooting abilities, suddenly viewed her with new interest and curiosity. The careful separation between her professional life and personal passion had been completely eliminated. The constant attention and pressure began affecting Margaret's daily routine and mental well-being. She found herself avoiding familiar places and changing her schedule to prevent unwanted encounters with reporters or curious community members. The independence she had cherished was being systematically eroded by public interest in her abilities. Colonel Patterson contacted Margaret several more times, his persistence driven by genuine admiration for her skills and belief that someone of her caliber belonged in military service. However, his continued pressure only reinforced Margaret's determination to maintain her civilian status and protect what remained of her privacy. 2 weeks after the initial incident, Margaret made a decision that surprised everyone who knew her. Instead of continuing to hide from the attention, she decided to address the situation directly and publicly. She contacted the local newspaper and arranged for a single, comprehensive interview that would provide accurate information about her background and definitively address the speculation surrounding her abilities. The interview, conducted by veteran reporter Susan Williams, took place at Precision Point during a special evening session arranged by Frank Morrison. Margaret spoke candidly about her father's influence on her shooting development, her dedication to the discipline, and her firm decision to remain a civilian shooter rather than pursue military or commercial opportunities. Margaret's decision to speak publicly was strategic rather than emotional. She hoped that by providing complete and accurate information about her background and intentions, she could reduce the ongoing speculation and media interest that had disrupted her life. She wanted to control the narrative rather than allow others to create stories about her. During the interview, Margaret demonstrated her shooting abilities for the photographer, though she insisted that the focus should be on the discipline and dedication required for marksmanship rather than sensationalizing her gender or the military's interest. She spoke eloquently about shooting as both art and science, requiring mental discipline as much as physical skill. The resulting newspaper article presented Margaret as a dedicated civilian shooter who had developed exceptional abilities through years of disciplined practice. The story emphasized her desire for privacy and her decision to remain in civilian life despite various opportunities for military or commercial applications of her skills. The article's publication had the intended effect of reducing media interest in Margaret's story. By providing comprehensive information and clearly stating her positions, she had satisfied the curiosity that had driven much of the unwanted attention. The mystery surrounding the exceptional female shooter had been resolved, making her less interesting to media outlets seeking sensational stories. However, the article also had unintended positive consequences for Margaret. Several young women contacted her through the newspaper, expressing interest in learning marksmanship and seeking guidance about developing shooting skills. Margaret found herself in the unexpected role of mentor and inspiration for others who shared her interest in the discipline. Frank Morrison suggested that Margaret consider offering instruction to interested students, particularly young women, who might benefit from her example and expertise. Initially reluctant to take on any public role, Margaret gradually began to see the value in sharing the knowledge and passion that her father had given her. Margaret's first student was 17-year-old Jennifer Walsh, whose parents had contacted her after reading the newspaper article. Jennifer was interested in competitive shooting but lacked access to qualified female instruction. Margaret agreed to provide basic training, viewing it as a way to honor her father's memory by passing on his teachings. The experience of teaching Jennifer proved unexpectedly rewarding for Margaret. She discovered that sharing her knowledge and watching another person develop their abilities provided satisfaction that complemented her own practice. Jennifer's enthusiasm and rapid progress reminded Margaret of her own early experiences learning from her father. Word of Margaret's instructions spread through the local shooting community, leading to requests from additional students. Margaret established careful boundaries around her teaching, limiting the number of students and maintaining strict focus on skill development rather than publicity or commercial success. Colonel Patterson made one final attempt to recruit Margaret, visiting her at the range during a teaching session. Observing Margaret working with Jennifer and seeing the positive impact she was having on the next generation of shooters, the colonel finally understood why she had chosen to remain civilian. He offered his respect for her decision and acknowledged that her contribution to the shooting community was valuable in its own right. Margaret's relationship with the broader shooting community evolved significantly following the publicity and her decision to teach. She began participating more actively in local competitions, not as the anonymous exceptional shooter, but as a mentor figure who encouraged others and promoted the discipline she loved. The range at Precision Point became known as a place where serious students could receive exceptional instruction from one of the finest civilian shooters in the region. Frank Morrison supported Margaret's teaching activities, providing facilities and encouraging the positive community atmosphere that developed around her program. Margaret's professional life also stabilized as the initial media interest faded. Her colleagues retained respect for her additional abilities, but returned to normal working relationships. The temporary disruption to her career had resolved without permanent damage, allowing her to maintain the work-life balance she preferred. 6 months after Colonel Patterson's initial visit, Margaret had established a new routine that incorporated her teaching responsibilities with her personal practice. She continued to arrive early for her own training but now stayed later to work with students. The solitary practice she had once valued was balanced with the satisfaction of helping others develop their abilities. Margaret's story became part of the local shooting community's history, though the initial sensationalism had given way to genuine respect for her contributions. She was recognized not as the mysterious woman who had impressed military recruiters, but as a dedicated practitioner who helped others appreciate the discipline and skill required for exceptional marksmanship. The reserved woman who had once sought complete privacy had found a different kind of fulfillment in sharing her passion with others, while maintaining boundaries that protected her personal life. Margaret learned that some forms of attention, when properly managed, could enhance rather than threaten the things she valued most. Jennifer Walsh eventually earned a shooting scholarship to college, crediting Margaret's instruction with developing both her technical skills and her confidence. Other students achieved their own goals, whether in competitive shooting, hunting, or simply personal satisfaction with their abilities. Margaret took quiet pride in these achievements, understanding that her father's legacy lived on through each person she taught. The military recruitment incident that had initially seemed like a disaster had ultimately led Margaret to discover a new dimension of her relationship with shooting. Teaching others had enriched her own understanding of the discipline while providing a way to contribute positively to her community. Colonel Patterson occasionally visited the range when traveling through the area, observing Margaret's teaching sessions with professional interest. He had come to appreciate that exceptional talent could serve the broader community in many ways. Not only through military service, Margaret's civilian contributions were valuable and worthy of respect. Frank Morrison often reflected on how the dramatic events had ultimately strengthened the shooting community at Precision Point. Margaret's presence as both exceptional practitioner and dedicated teacher had elevated the range's reputation and attracted serious students from throughout the region. Margaret's evening routine now included reviewing her students' progress and planning instruction sessions alongside her own practice goals. The careful balance between personal development and teaching responsibilities had become natural, providing structure and purpose that exceeded what she had found in solitary practice. 2 years after the colonel's visit, Margaret received an invitation to speak at a national conference on civilian marksmanship. Initially reluctant to accept such a public role, she eventually agreed to participate, recognizing that her story might encourage others to pursue their own shooting interests despite obstacles or unconventional circumstances. The reserved woman who had once hidden her exceptional abilities had discovered that sharing her passion with others, while maintaining appropriate boundaries, could create positive outcomes she had never imagined. Margaret's journey from anonymous, exceptional shooter to respected mentor demonstrated that even the most private individuals could find meaningful ways to contribute to their communities. Margaret Chen's story became an inspiration to many, not because of the initial military interest or media attention, but because of how she had transformed an unwanted disruption into an opportunity for positive contribution. The woman who had been practicing shots in quiet anonymity had become a teacher whose influence extended far beyond her own remarkable abilities, proving that true exceptional talent finds its greatest expression when shared with others who hunger to learn and grow.